And really, Dr. Verhoeven is going to talk tonight about what does that mean for a liberal arts school to be rooted in the Buddhist tradition. Our educational model is primarily based on reading texts from various traditions. We have a master's program that focuses primarily on Buddhist materials, but our bachelor's program is a broader liberal arts program that reads classical works from a variety of traditions from around the world. And the goal there is that we believe that all these different traditions have a lot of really valuable insights about the human condition, kind of the universal big questions about what it means to be a human person in this world and the difficulties that we face. And we also believe that even though some of these texts are thousands of years old, they still have really incredible insights that we can bring to today. And so the goal of having this reading and discussion process is to figure out what can we learn from these texts and how can we apply it to our everyday life in order to work with our hearts, work with our minds, and kind of, live in a way that is happier, more in harmony with ourselves, with the world around us, with the people around us, and how can that be a basis for building a stronger, healthier society? I'll briefly introduce Dr. Verhoeven. Dr. Verhoeven is currently a professor of Buddhist classics at the university, and as I said before, he previously served as our dean of academics and one of the thought leaders who developed the modern programs that we're now offering, our degree programs and certificate programs. Dr. Verhoeven has a background both in academic study of history and various philosophical traditions, as well as lived Buddhist practice. He was a visiting scholar at Stanford under a Ford Fellowship in the 1970s. And in 1976, shortly around the time of the founding of DRBU, the original founding of DRBU, he met and trained under the founder of DRBU, the Venerable Master Xuanhua. Dr. Verhoeven became a monk at that time with the name of Heng Chao in 1977, and he took full ordination in 1979. Studying with Master Hua took him to many places around the world, monasteries, temples, Buddhist communities, and it also led to him undertaking a 2-year-long 600-mile bowing pilgrimage up the California coast with another monk of the organization, Reverend Heng Shi, from 1977 to 1979. That kind of bowing pilgrimage is a traditional practice in the Chinese Buddhist tradition as well as in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And it was a bit unusual. It was, I think, the second bowing pilgrimage like that had been undertaken by American monks in the United States. After 18 years as a monk, Dr. Verhoeven returned to lay life, continued to study and teach Buddhism in the United States as well as around the world, and completed his PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Madison on the American encounter with Asian religions, which is something that's happening at Dharma Realm Buddhist University. We're a Buddhist university located in the United States, and so part of the role that we're serving is as a place for discussions between different traditions, different cultures, different backgrounds. So, Dr. Verhoeven, I'm very pleased to pass the conversation over to you. I'm sure everyone is looking forward to learning about Buddhist education.
Really good to be here with all of you tonight. And I hope you find it worthwhile. Preparing for this really got me thinking about a lot of things in terms of my development and about the kind of innovative and yet conservative, in a sense, of drawing from the ancient traditions project we're undertaking with Buddhist education and the broad Buddhist tradition. So maybe I'll say a little bit about that tonight. I'm going to do it in two areas. One is, if we can understand what this thing Buddhism is, then from there we might consider why it matters, especially as someone asked me to do in the so-called, quote, modern world. And I would argue that something so seemingly ancient is both timeless and timely. And it's even more important in the modern than ever before. And so it's a little bit of what I hope to do in the little time we have together tonight. Let me, I'll start with a story I've told before. it has to do with coming to understand my understanding of Buddhism. In the early days at Gold Mountain Monastery, which was in San Francisco, was the kind of the seed monastery for Dharma Buddhist Association. This was back in the mid-70s. A Buddhist scholar, a very noted Buddhist scholar, came to visit and gave lectures. By the way, the early monastery at Gold Mountain was both a school and a monastery simultaneously. We had Confucian, Taoist, Buddhist scholars, atheists, Christians, rabbis, politicians. We hosted many events there where the politicians used as a platform to present their ideas and try to get votes and so forth. So it was a very open, ecumenical, you could say, in a very broad sense. But in any event, this Buddhist scholar came and he asked all of us who were sitting around with the teacher, what's the essence of Buddhism? And so Master Hua at that time liked to test us a bit. So he'd had each one of us give an answer what it was. And someone answered, well, it's prajna, and somebody else, and then, no, it's meditation. Somebody else answered, no, it's the precepts. Somebody answered, no, it's non-attachment. And every time he'd shake his head, no. And there was a young novice there, about 11 or 12, and he really liked to be number one in learning and platform spotlighting. And so he would volunteer his answers, and he was getting kind of disappointed that he wasn't getting the prize. And so he finally said, well, if that's not what it is, you tell me what it is, Master. And the Master at that point said, the essence of Buddhism is change. Just one word, is change. And the little novice said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, if you're a bad person, when you come in, you have to become good. Because at that time, a number of the early disciples had belonged to Chinese gangs, and they were engaged in some serious warfare among themselves, often coming to the monastery with guns and knives and so forth. And the Master said, so you have to stop killing and stealing and be a good person. Then the novice said, well, if you're a good person, then what? He said, well, you have to become a sage. And the novice said, well, okay, if I become a sage, then what? So he switched to I become a sage, then what? And the Master said, well, then you have to become a bodhisattva. And the novice said, oh, then what? Is that it? And he said, no, then you have to become a Buddha. He said, okay, then I can retire. And the Master said, no, then you have to become a bodhisattva again and go back and teach and transform others. And then the little novice said, I thought everything stops with nirvana. And Master Hua's response was very pointed. He says, no, everything stops being a problem with nirvana. Once the problem stops, you can begin the work in earnest now. So I bring up this story to emphasize that Master Hua's reading of it and my reading of the text is that this, what we call Buddhism, is actually a transformative teaching. It is something that is indispensably linked with practice, with self-cultivation and personal transformation. It's something that's done. Yes, it's studied, but the point of the study is to undergo a deep, profound awakening, transformation, and then open up a heart of compassion for others. This model also harkens back to one of the first, and I think the oldest university in the world in India. It was called Nalanda University. Located in India, was built around 800 before the Common Era. And the subjects included the Vedas, sutras, grammar, philosophy, astronomy, medicine, even surgery, politics, archery, the art of warfare, music, and commerce were all taught there. In short, it was the liberal arts epitome of learning at its time. And the interesting thing about Nalanda was the monastic and lay were there together. It was a huge complex. Xuanzang, the great Buddhist monks who came from China to gather the Tripitaka in India, studied there. But what I want to point out here is this ancient model is really where DRBU is also rooted. The scholar practitioner model. There was no strict dichotomy at Nalanda, nor at DRBU between the secular and the sacred, between study and practice. And we continue that. this is the broad Buddhist tradition. So if education is the understanding and expanding of the mind and increasing our capacity for living meaningful lives and improving the human and the planetary condition and arriving at some deeper grasp of what it is to be true, to be good, and liberated to the extent that humanly and maybe humanely possible, then Buddhism and education are identical. And I would say that this is a very good description of Buddhism and also a very good description of what real education is about. There's a famous line in the Dharma that basically says, looking for Bodhi, looking for awakening apart from the world, apart from the here and now existential situation you're in, can't be done. It's right here in your situation, it's right here in the world. And then it says, if you're looking for it apart from your here and now world that you're in, it's like looking for a rabbit with antlers. Of course, this was before genetic engineering. I'm sure they have rabbits with antlers now, but at least at the time this text was given, this was an absurdity. So, and in fact, you look at the entire journey of the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, it was deeply educational. He went from teacher to teacher. It wasn't devotional per se, but it was driven by questions and doubts and a kind of fearless sifting and winnowing search for the truth. So if you look on our website, you'll see one key element of our mission statement is we are dedicated to liberal education in the broad Buddhist tradition. This tradition is characterized by three things: knowledge in the arts of arts and sciences, self-cultivation, and the pursuit of wisdom. So as Justin mentioned, at the graduate level, we're featuring Buddhist classics. It's an MA in Buddhist classics, but the undergraduate level harkens back to the early days of Nalanda, of the broad-based liberal arts education. So from the Iliad and the Odyssey to Shakespeare, Confucius, the Tao Te Ching, Darwin, the Mahabharata, theory of relativity, quantum physics. We're exploring all the learning and wisdom traditions that are available as much as we can cover in 4 years. Obviously, it's seminal, it's not exhaustive, it's a seed. But the most important part of it is to reactivate one of the primary goals of education coming out of the ancient world, both East and West. But that was to actually come to a deep understanding of yourself and to find wisdom within your own being and not simply borrowing it from other texts. There's the Latin for education comes from educere, and also educare, but the educere one is the one that we favor, which implies a process of awakening and a development and becoming. And the tools for this process include dialogue, deep reading, the arts, or any course of study or action. And there's a key for me, which strengthens the student's critical faculties and sharpens their senses and expands their mental space. I want to repeat that again, which strengthens the student's critical faculties, sharpens their senses, and expands their mental space. This is both East and West in terms of, if you go back to Plato, Socrates, Plutarch, and you go into the ancient Nalanda and even the universities, Buddhist universities throughout East Asia at the time, they were in pursuit of this kind of path. Maybe tell a side note here, it's very interesting. Just recently, we joined faculty at Caltech to have a discussion of artificial intelligence and ethics. And obviously, mine was the ethics presentation. I don't know much about artificial intelligence, but I did have a colleague who's a brilliant scientist, and he said, Marty, it's neither artificial nor intelligent. So I'm still pondering what he meant by that. But in any event, in the course of that discussion, there was a very bright young professor from Caltech, very enthusiastic about AI and its prospects. But then it came up in the conversation, in the presentation, that artificial intelligence and robotics have basically now replaced 50% of the job market, or the jobs available, say, in the United States. And that is growing almost exponentially. And so we started to have a conversation. A place like Caltech, which is STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, is graduating and teaching students that increasingly can be taught through computers and artificial intelligence, and not needing professors. Moreover, the skills they're learning are not necessarily, quote, marketable as they once believed, because the takeoff of artificial intelligence at the highest levels are starting to replace the jobs they would get for coding and programming and so forth. So they were facing a kind of anxiety that they were paying $80,000 or something a year for this education, with the prospect of maybe being overqualified for Chipotle or McDonald's and being under needed in the high tech. And he acknowledged this. At this point, we had a really interesting conversation. And I said, what's our role as professors? And he noted, he said, we'll be the first on the chopping block, because we can be replaced. The content delivery that we do could easily be replaced by AI. And there was this pause, and I said, well, what do you think then would be the most important dimension of higher education in the 21st century? And he simply said, critical thinking. Critical thinking. Now I go back to the quote I just read to you: strengthens a student's critical faculties, sharpens their senses, and expands their mental space. That probably is the most important function. And then he looked at me with a smile and he goes, oh my God, that's humanities, isn't it? And I said, yeah, we'd be happy to have you on board if you want to join. So to go on a little bit, DRBU was inspired and founded on this model. It's sort of the deep ancient root and purport, and I would rather call it Buddha Dharma than Buddhism. And basically it's to inquire and ask questions, important questions that thinkers have continued to raise over millennia, and hence the classics, because the classics are a repository for that timely and timeless heritage of really significant, important questions regarding our relationship to ourselves psychologically, our relationship to others, the social dimension, and increasingly more important, our relation to the natural world. They have thought about this, they have written about this, and so our students and faculty alike join in the process of looking at what they had to say and then bringing it to engage in our actual self-understanding and possibilities for moving forward. So it's not just extensive learning, but it's also intensive self-reflection. And this is, I think, maybe something unique to us that we find really critical, is the need for contemplative exercise, contemplative study for self-reflection, and not simply absorbing or parroting bodies of knowledge or downloading it. So the focus is more on how to think than what to think. And that slows things down, requires close conversation and listening, and leaving a space of non-judgmental openness for students to raise questions. Basically, it's an aim in the Buddhist tradition, it's called activating inherent wisdom, or I would say activating and igniting our inherent capacity for knowing, for wisdom and compassion. The larger goal is to be truly conscious of one's place in the cosmos and its place in us. Not just our place in the cosmos, but the place of the cosmos and nature in us. Let me share with you two inspirations for me. My early years, of course, Justin didn't mention, but I did a great books classics program like this when I was an undergraduate. And I remember being excited when I came upon this quote by Plutarch. It's in his writings called Moralia. And I'll give you two translations, because this is what we do with the students too. Sometimes we look at the original, if we sometimes Greek or Latin, but Sanskrit or Pali and Chinese, and then we say this is a translation, but it's an interpretation. How do you think it could be interpreted? And then they take beginning skills in the languages and try to retranslate or reinterpret it, and not just assume that the standard translation out there is definitive or authoritative. So I'll give you two translations of this. This is an early one. It says, this is from Plutarch. For the mind does not require filling like a bottle, but rather like wood, it only requires kindling to create in it an impulse to think independently and an ardent desire for the truth. Now, this is an early 1927 translation, a more modern translation, but conveying the same thing. For the correct analogy for the mind and learning, the mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting, no more. And then it motivates one towards originality and instills the desire for truth. So this really captures, I think, the pedagogical spirit of our program, shared inquiry, we call it, where we have discussion around a round table. Everybody reads the text originally once or twice, and we begin a close reading and close discussion of it, trying our best to arrive at not only a good interpretation, but a good implication for how we might be different after reading this. So we're not really just asking, what does the author mean or what is the text saying? But we're asking another question: how is the text of the author in some way asking us to be different, to change in some way prior to having encountered this teaching? To kind of support that this is the broad Buddhist tradition. I quoted Plutarch, but I think Plutarch would have had a wonderful discussion with the Buddha, undoubtedly. But this is right from the Buddha. This is the Kalama Sutta. And I'll just quote one key passage from it. This is where the Buddha is asked, what should we rely on? What should we believe? Who should we listen to? Where should we place our authority? And here's his answer that he gave to him. Do not believe in anything simply because you heard it. Do not believe in traditions because they've been handed down for many generations. Do not believe in anything because it is spoken or rumored by many. Do not believe in anything simply because it is found in your religious books. Do not believe in anything merely on the authority of your teachers and elders. But after observation and analysis, when you find that it agrees with reason and goodness, and it's conducive to the good and the benefit of one and all, then accept and live up to it. Only when you know for yourselves this, can it be said you learned it. Now, this is from a Buddhist text. So I want to leave some time for questions, and excuse me, I sip my tea here. I hope you all are having something to support you through my long-winded conversation here. Let me, I really gave short shrift to the program. I try to get the essence of it out, what we're trying to do. It's a art. It's something that's never perfect. It's always approaching improvement. One of the things that we find that really works well is none of the professors are professing. They're all joining in to read these texts together with the students, and they teach across the curriculum. In the undergraduate area, they'll teach in the Eastern classics, they'll teach in the Western classics, they teach in the Indian classics, the Chinese classics, math, literature, philosophy, even the science courses. Everybody joins in, goes over the text together, and it becomes a joint enterprise. This is very exciting for the students, by the way, because it activates a kind of confidence in their own ability to read something closely and form their own opinions and not simply have it handed down to them. But it's also challenging for the faculty because their growth is not simply to grow in the discipline they got their PhD in, but to expand and to go into all the other areas. And interestingly, it's extremely refreshing. You can get out of a rut. Somebody who's trained in say biology, all of a sudden finds themselves reading Shakespeare. And the students find this refreshing too, because basically they're seeing good minds at work rather than experts. And it's the good mind at work that we really want to activate, not expertise per se. So let me just say a couple more things, and then I think the plan, Justin, was to open it up for some questions. Is that right? Okay. the part I'm going into now is the question, why, if this is what Buddhist education is, then why does it matter? Why does it matter? There's many things I feel and I could say about this, but let me just make 2 points tonight. And maybe some of them are a bit controversial, but they are things that I feel are becoming the defining issues of our time and the defining challenge for higher education. The first one is something scholars have pointed out. It's called divided knowledge, the problem of divided knowledge. And in that, we're trying to counteract a tendency in higher education, basically, where the curriculum is fragmented into increasingly unrelated disciplines and subdisciplines. But more importantly, where the student, him or herself, is left divided. The dividing of the body and the mind, the intellect and emotion, fact and value, matter and spirit. This splitting of identity and awareness can actually reach a point where many, if not most students, can graduate without any meaningful vision or sense of purpose, or worse, any compass by which to find such a purpose. So what we're trying to do is to do what we call embodied versus disembodied, or integral learning versus divided knowledge, and reverse that trend in modern higher education and modern life. That's kind of characterized by the absence of any coherent moral code and a fragmented sense of being, a lack of meaningful sense of purpose in their lives. And also, we're finding more and more also a lack of a sense of participating and belonging to a genuine community. So this is somewhat of the spirit of DRBU. The curriculum itself, the content of it, goes to an integrated, all required sequential learning where all the students are reading the same text together over their 4 years or their 2 years. It's not a series of courses and sub-courses or sub-disciplines. And what unites it is their cohort sharing over 2 years or 4 years, getting to know each other better, and deeply going into these texts in a coherent and sequential manner. That's the content. But equally important is a sense of this matters. They come to it with a serious sense of purpose, that it matters to them as people, not only what they know, but how are they to become more full and more alive and more engaged in a constructive way. And so the content, the conveyance of this is important, because the conveyance of shared inquiry and slowly doing dialogical discussion back and forth opens up a kind of learning that would in fact continue for the rest of life. It isn't necessarily the case that they get all these things or the fragmentation ceases, but at least there's an opportunity to explore it and to challenge it and to see if there's some alternative that emerges, not just from the text, but the collegiality and the spirit of the campus, where students and their questions are taken seriously. Yeah. The other thing I want to talk about is something that's maybe not as shared, but it's something that I have, as a historian, become aware of. In the 1940s and 50s, both Arnold Toynbee and Alfred North Whitehead made comments similar to what they were saying. Basically was, as we enter the 20th century, the most difficult problem facing humanity would be how to reconcile religion and science. That so powerful was science that guided the material aspects of our lives, and so powerful were the values and beliefs that gave meaning to our life from the religion, that without coming together, we faced an incredibly difficult splitting. And so the reconciliation of that was what they looked at as being the most significant event, not the atomic bomb, not even the wars, but this event. And actually, both of them had the belief that somehow philosophies from the Eastern, South Asia, East Asia traditions would possibly reinvigorate and provide a bridge between the technological material aspects of Western society with a more meaningful sort of spiritual, human value-centered approach. That was their hope. Right now, I think this has shifted, and it's no longer the reconciliation of science and religion, but something maybe that's spun off of that. And this comes from my readings. Since the late 1950s, let's say, a number of philosophers, both East and West, I'll cite some you may know them. One is C.P. Snow, who did a famous essay on two cultures, basically talking about this split. Martin Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, Jean-Francois Lyotard, T.T. Suzuki, and even my teacher. These are just a few. But while I was doing my research at the university, I started to notice a trend that they were pointing to, that they called that almost every aspect of contemporary life, not only the material machine technology and science that was at the center of our civilization, but even our art, our religion, and culture. And here's what's interesting: even human consciousness itself was exhibiting what they call the clear marks of the ruling essence of technology. So no longer was religion and science, but it was basically human consciousness in some tension with modern technology. And they would use such expression like man or human beings, in a sense, become the very machine consciousness they invent. And this assumes dominion over everything outside of the person and inside the person, objectifying and controlling everything. Heidegger noted that so completely has people been drawn into that dominion that it actually cuts off from awareness our own essence. Another kind of observation they made: a living organism was losing itself into the machine. Its defining feature is a new kind of what they call cognitive automation that makes humans and software-driven machines substitutes rather than complements. In other words, they were saying prior, in the earlier industrial revolution and such, these tools were taken up and used as complements to human design, agency, and autonomy. But more and more, they're becoming substitutes and replacements for that. So this is, I could share more with you on this, but I'm just saying this is something that I started to notice. And it's becoming more apparent that this technology is extremely intoxicating, exciting. Some people think very promising, but also very addictive. So the issue might be closer to a deeper concern, even expressed by Hawking, the brilliant Cambridge physicist, and Hinton, one of the Nobel winners for the invention of AI, when they started giving out warnings and caveats about where this could possibly go. And one of their points was whatever we're gaining, or the promise of what we're gaining, blinds us to what we are subtly losing. And this is what they call the control and capture of the mind. The language out there for that now is consciousness capture or cognitive capture. My friend, the Chinese philosopher Henry Rosemont, about 10 years ago, we were having a conversation, and he said, you know, the most important force in the modern world is not going to be the economy, and it's not even going to be weaponry. It's going to be consciousness and gaining mastery and market share control over consciousness. The whole thing driving the modern economy and even higher education now is to map out and provide tools and mechanisms to gain mastery control over human consciousness. We can see this at the political level, Cambridge Analytica. We can see it in recent the massive amounts of disinformation that are available to this and the susceptibility without critical thinking that people have to this. One of the questions I was thinking was Stephen Hawking and Hinton and these others were able to make these comparisons between where we're going and where we came from, because they all had classical educations. And so they could do a juxtaposition and say, here's what we're losing, here's what we're gaining. My question would be, what happens when the only world of the reality experience encompass one knows a digital, disembodied screen, computer generation imagining? A generation of young people brought up only on this will not have any comparison. And so this will be sort of the ground, the very ground of their being. That idea of building upon and augmenting our previous knowledge and values, relationships, and sensibilities will be totally different for someone weaned entirely on the internet. Actually, the phrase they use is called iGen, or the iGeneration. Yeah. So what they are saying, and what it seems to me they were pointing to, that something that's very different about this particular paradigm shift that seeps into our minds and fundamentally alters human consciousness itself. If I have time, maybe I'll just take a few minutes to point out, again, some of us who are sort of post-World War II, or, that's maybe not even half this audience tonight, has this ability to juxtapose and compare. But in the generation that's coming, last two generations coming from, say, the 1990s on, there's a growing sense of what they call hyperuse of this technology. So, for example, in less than 3 years, the average attention span has fallen from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. And it's dropping daily. By the way, a goldfish has 9 seconds. So we're beat out by a goldfish in terms of the ability to focus and sustain concentration. In 2023-24, 3 hours a day plus was the average time. It's now gone up to 6 or 7 hours a day on phones and computers. That's 11 years in a lifetime. 64% of the people between 18 and 64 sleep with their phones. Sleep with their phones. And 48% have even found what they call doing zombie scrolling, just mindlessly scrolling to out of distraction, habit, boredom. The generation between 13 and 28, 74% of them get anxious making calls or talking on the phone, and yet 90% of them sleep with their phone within arm's reach. Over 50% feel panic when their phone battery is running low or the internet isn't working. And 22% have increased heart rate, sweating, restlessness, and situations like that when they're using their phones. What psychologists call identification, a psychological orientation of the self in regard to something, such as a person or group, is now happening with devices and not groups necessarily. And it's a largely unconscious process where an individual models thoughts, feelings, and actions after those attributed to an object that has been incorporated in. So this is what Lyotard has called the computerization of society, or the computerization of consciousness. Just to quote a few things, Husserl, for example, said this mentality, this taking over the computerization of consciousness, frees us the full potential of consciousness. I'm quoting him, confining it to appearances and the surface of things, much like the prisoner in the cave of Plato's famous cave parable. Heidegger called it inframing, as if we frame ourselves, and he says it's a homogenizing and standardizing, which are the two essential functions and purposes of digitalization: homogenizing and standardizing, and reducing human experience to objects, turns the world and ourselves into things, and the consequent deformation of consciousness and the loss of contemplative knowing. His last work in the 50s was a call to restore contemplative knowing rather than what he called calculative knowing at the heart of higher education. And he was also indirectly, ever he came to this, inspired from some of the Taoist and the Hindu teachings on contemplative studies. But he came to this independently in the 50s as he saw this phenomenon happening. And he says, if we don't do that, we are going to increasingly become unable to hear the call of the more primal truth. Anyway, I don't want to dwell on this too much. I'm just saying, in my thinking, well, let me quote you one more. This is Master Hua. Around the same time, it's interesting that I consider these guys, these philosophers, as sort of canaries in the mind, and they're all coming to this independently. Master Hua didn't read Heidegger or Husserl. Husserl didn't read Master Hua, and so forth. But this is Master Hua's take around the same time, early 60s, late 70s, early 70s. He says, in Chinese, a word for computer translates literally into electric brain. In the future, there will be electric eyes, as well as electric ears, and electric tongues, electric noses, and electric bodies. Every one of the 6 organs will have disposable modules like cassettes and will gain an electric boost. Now, he was using cassettes, you could say, just like what, flash drives or implants. Eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind will be computerized. I mean, wow, this is what Leotard was saying. Even the mind will tie in organically with know-it-all computer memory banks. 1960s. Is this a good time to be a person, he asked? Our wisdom has been stolen away by these material things. Nobody has any natural wisdom to speak of. Our inherent brightness has been replaced by products and goods. And once we substitute things for wisdom, then people will grow up blank like idiots. Wisdom will become outmoded. People will no longer serve any useful purpose. So I will end here. I'm not sure all the faculty feels as strongly about this as I do, but we are having very animated and thoughtful discussions about how we are to respond and incorporate or to hold ourselves in contrast to this computerization and the capture of consciousness. I would say for me, DRBU is a kind of oasis of consciousness, of human consciousness, kind of a sanctuary, a preserve of something that is somewhat of an endangered species. And in fact, out of this, not from Buddhism, but from other philosophies, social scientists, educators, comes a new idea called cognitive liberty. Cognitive liberty, it's a new field of study. It refers to the right of self-determination of individuals to control their own mental processes, cognition, and consciousness, including by the use of various neurotechnologies. This is very interesting. So I think I will stop there, but I will end with an ancient quote from actually a Taoist text. And this is very early on and before the Common Era. But it is a model for what I think DRBU's educational thrust is as well. The author of this, who's unknown, says, what all people wish to know is that, the nature of reality and the nature of themselves and the purpose of their lives. But their means of knowing that is this, their own being, their own minds, their own natures. The third line goes, how can they possibly know that? And the finishing line is only by nurturing and developing this. So what I'm trying to express here is that we're paying attention to that with knowledge of the arts and sciences, but we're also paying equally close attention to this, the inner contemplative, if you want, spiritual, deeply human development possibilities. And combining these, maybe we can reconcile some of these unfortunate splits. But any event, the last line is from the DRBU mission statement. As an institution aiming at educating the whole person, DRBU strives to nurture individuals who see learning as a lifelong endeavor in the pursuit of knowledge, self-understanding, and the creative and beneficial application of that learning to every sphere of life. So, finished. Thank you for being patient and listening to all this.